I have the difficult task of speaking to you about the witness of Dietrich von Hildebrand, and it's difficult because it's so enormously rich. It's so full, and we have it in this wonderful narrative format of von Hildebrand's own memoirs. So I'm going to try to do the following. I'm going to sort of approach this from 2 points of view, and I might just sort of interrupt myself midstream. So on the one hand, what I'd like to do is survey the life of von Hildebrand, specifically the period during which his fight against Nazism began, and specifically to do it looking for moments in which his witness is revealed. It's easy perhaps to think of witness as a kind of static standing for truth, but in reality, in anyone's life, and in von Hildebrand's life, it emerges dynamically, and it's important, I think, to see that happening to fully appreciate it. And then what I'll do is at some point, if I can't cover the entire period in the short time I have, I will sort of interrupt and try to distill what I think are some of the major themes of his witness, with the understanding that you all have recourse to the wonderful memoir and can actually read this yourself. So hopefully my remarks give you something with which to work as you go back for your reading. So we've already spoken about the philosophical critique that von Hildebrand gave to the Nazis, and especially how this is expressive of his personalism. And more could be said, of course, of his political and cultural vision, and I, in many ways, will defer to our distinguished colleague, Professor Rocco Buttiglione, on that, because this is so close to your own work on the vision of Europe, the vision of the Christian West, and von Hildebrand has a great deal to say there. So what I want to do is to look at how his critique of Nazism becomes enfleshed somehow through his own words and deeds. And I want to look in a special way at the respect in which his moral witness is rich in practical moral wisdom. So while we'll talk in part about his critique of Nazism, we're going to look in some sense primarily at the man and how he operated, how he navigated. Now, let's clarify briefly the meaning of witness. What is witness? Now, in the broad sense, witness is to give, we all understand this term to mean, for example, the witness in the courtroom who gives testimony. And there's the understanding that the witness somehow gives testimony to something that perhaps is not otherwise evident. He is a credible or an uncredible witness, an eyewitness or a character witness, all kinds of witnesses. The gospel writers are witnesses to Christ. Christians are witnesses to each other. So in one sense, the whole substance of Hildebrand's life and thought is his witness. But I want to explore it in a more focused way for now, and that doesn't exclude the larger. Let me quote something that the former Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl, said of von Hildebrand. He said that Dietrich von Hildebrand was a witness from a dark era in German history. And again, while this captures more than perhaps I want to highlight, it brings out the respect in which von Hildebrand bore witness to truths about God and man that were obscured at this time, that were lost in the moral fog, in the ideological confusion, in the social and political ferment of the time. And in this respect, von Hildebrand's witness is a kind of sort of standard-bearing act for an entire vision that was being lost at the time. So, now I want to make just two brief important observations about von Hildebrand's philosophical and religious odyssey, only because it's very difficult, I think, to sort of get to the essence of his witness without having these in mind. And you can read about these in more detail in the introduction to My Battle Against Hitler, but let me just mention them briefly. The first connects with his philosophical vocation, and that's this inner orientation to truth. And if you know anything about the life of von Hildebrand and his early discovery of philosophy, you know it began with the reading of the dialogues of Plato. And he was captivated by the figure of Socrates. And the reason for that was because that in Plato and in Socrates he found an exploration of truth that wasn't just about being right or correct or even true in some kind of formal sense. It was this idea that truth has a kind of primacy over all other human questions and concerns, that truth matters more than anything else. To know the truth matters more than any kind of pragmatic gain that one might have, or even the usefulness of truth when it might be applied. And I think that this comes out also in the way in which he speaks about truth. He doesn't speak about it in primarily intellectual terms. He speaks about it with a great ardor that we would normally reserve for beauty or for things that we love. But that's what was awakened in the young von Hildebrand in this reading of Plato was truth, not just as the object of the intellect, but in some sense as the pursuit of the person, and in one important respect, therefore, the object of love. And this is why he loves to quote St. Augustine, who speaks of yearning for truth in the most inward of ways. This comes out also in von Hildebrand's frequent use of the Latin expression tua res agitur, which means this concerns you. He wants to say that these questions of philosophy, even when they're expressed in their most formal terms, are ultimately serious because they provide, you might say, the infrastructure of truth, the infrastructure around which we build our existence. And in this respect, particularly in a world in which any kind of talk of truth raises suspicion, at least in von Hildebrand's account of it, while truth is limiting in one sense, it is in fact the key to freedom. It is the great key to the adventure of life. It's the sort of the anti-Steve Jobs vision, right, who says that to subscribe to truths other than your own truth in some sense is to live by other people's dogmas. Now the other great moment in von Hildebrand's life, and I must say I underappreciated this over the years, is his conversion to Christianity, which took place in 1914. He and his first wife were baptized at Easter. And the reason I underestimated it is because I tended to view his fight against the Nazis, his fight against National Socialism in moral and philosophical terms. And that, of course, is true. But what comes out in his memoirs and in passages that are not translated in the book, and for reasons that I can explain at another time, will have to be shared at a later date. There's a great deal of intimacy in them. Von Hildebrand identifies his conversion as the great moment in his life, and he was quite conscious of this fact when it took place, that there was a kind of before and after. I think the best way of putting it, perhaps, is that again, this claim of truth on his life took on a whole new meaning. Truth is no longer simply the truth of reality. Truth is a person. Truth is Christ. But also the fact that von Hildebrand discovered the realm of grace, that grace is, in fact, irreducible to nature. Grace is in fact, the first essay he wrote after his conversion, it took many years, it took 6 or 7 years, was called The New World of Christendom. And it's a meditation on this reality of grace as irreducible to nature. So sanctity, for example, is not reducible to natural virtue. And this made an enormous impression on him, and in some sense it opened the horizons much further than they already were for him as a phenomenologist. Now, one point that's important, and I will meditate with you a little bit more on how both this orientation to truth and this conversion develop in his fight against Nazism. But it's worth bearing in mind that von Hildebrand himself did insist that it was his philosophical orientation that paved the way for his coming to faith. And he says in one place, if I can find it, he says, "It was not faith that determined my fundamental philosophical orientation. Rather, it was my faith that leveled the path for my reception into the church." And it was, again, this profound inner orientation to truth, this recognition that truth above all matters, and then this discovery of a whole other realm of truth. Much more could be said also about the role of beauty in his conversion, and I'll simply say that inasmuch as he was a convert really from one can't say he was a convert from Christianity to Catholicism. He was really a convert to Christianity because his family's nominal Protestantism was completely formal and cultural, so he was baptized because that's what one did. But there was no real life of faith in his family. The faith of his family life was beauty. It was the language of art, and it was, of course, a classical notion of beauty, or a neoclassicism in his father's work. His father was a great sculptor and artist, and von Hildebrand grew up steeped in the home in Florence where he was born, and then in Munich in later years where his father built a home. He grew up steeped in the world of great German and European art and culture, and this filled the role of religion. And I won't say whose radio show I was on, but I was describing this recently to a host, and they said, "Oh, they were a bunch of secular humanists." That is fundamentally false. Alice von Hildebrand sometimes says they were noble pagans, by which she means the paganism really of a kind of pre-Christian era, because Christianity was so non-present. And what she means by that is that they lived in a kind of fundamental reverence for natural things, for nature, and a reverence for beauty. And for von Hildebrand, he never repudiated that. In fact, that became the basis of his conversion. Finally, it was the beauty of the saints, it was the beauty of Christ that brought him ultimately into the church. And in some sense, the intellectual dimension caught up with that. He spent a great deal of time studying his faith after his conversion. In fact, he spent 6 or 7 years immersed in Augustine and the Fathers, knowing he had to educate himself. And there's a certain paradox there, isn't there, between, on the one hand, his insistence that it was his realism and it was his orientation to truth that paved the way for his faith, but that his ultimate entry into the faith wasn't the conclusion to a lot of dogmatic study or the reading of history. It was a kind of encounter with sanctity and with the holiness of Christ, the divinity of Christ, which I think was as much mediated through the orientation to truth as it was this powerful perceptive sense for beauty. And again, one could say a lot more about that, but let's see here. Okay. So before I say something about his life, I just want to make one assertion, I suppose. And it's a challenge to all of you in reading this period in general, and I think you all know it maybe in a formal way, but bring it into your future reading of Hildebrand and others. And this is to say that it is easy to admire von Hildebrand's story, and to admire it as a kind of story of courage where we see him surrounded by evil and by wicked people, by the Nazis and by structural evil in the form of National Socialism. But one would miss the achievement of von Hildebrand and his ability to see so clearly if one assumed that everyone around him had the kind of clarity that we today benefit by. In fact, while there were other clear-sighted people, and of course people's consciences weren't completely dead, it's important to immerse yourself enough in the period. And I can assure you that when you read enough of for example, if you read enough sort of far-right nationalist German sort of writing from the period, either in the newspapers or even if you read enough sort of racist talk or anti-Semitism, you don't have to agree with it, but you have to have, there are these kind of moments of historical empathy where it has to become plausible. You have to imagine what it might have been like to somehow think that this really was true and not the sort of madness that we now see it to be. And it's in that context that von Hildebrand spoke with such clarity at a moment when so many people were swept away by ideology, influenced by sort of enormously difficult economic circumstances. I think many of us maybe have we like to think of ourselves as patriots, I'm sure, but many of us maybe feel a little bit more arm's length to our country at times, or we cling to visions of what it might be, but not what it is. But for many at the time, there was a much greater immediacy in this sense of being German and this terrible loss of the First World War and the loss of German pride and prestige was deeply felt by people. So one can be impressed by him because one can say, well, he stood up in a setting where there were great consequences to his actions because he could at any point have been suppressed. But the fact is that he first saw with clarity when so few people did. Now, let me just look through the life somewhat at high speed and try to make some observations about his witness. So we've already heard about this 1921 peace conference he attended in Paris, where he was sort of goaded into making, they hoped to sort of catch him off guard and to show that in fact he wasn't really committed to sort of honest peace building after the war. And he was asked what he thought of the invasion of Belgium. Belgium was neutral, and the neutrality of Belgium was in fact signed by a treaty in the name of the Holy Trinity, if you can believe it. And so that brings a certain resonance to his statement then when he says that it was an atrocious crime. And I say this as a Catholic because I'm Catholic, and this is his allusion to the fact that this treaty was signed by Catholic Belgium under this protection of the Holy Trinity. So what I see in that, among many other things, the independence of spirit, the independence from the time, is I see public truth-telling. This is the first time that he emerges on the stage. So when I think of von Hildebrand's witness, it begins with a public dimension. Now, this anti-nationalism, you may remember, cost him an early career move. He had an opportunity to teach in Prague at the university, and it was a university controlled by Germans, the Sudeten Germans, the German majority in Czechoslovakia, who were very nationalist for reasons that are perhaps obvious. They felt a natural attachment to Germany. And yet he was so prone to making these strong statements against aggressive nationalism, and he was warned. They said, you'll ruin your chances for this position. And he said, the battle against nationalism belongs to my mission. Cannot make compromises in order to secure my career. So you have two themes there. You have this theme of a mission, which becomes increasingly self-conscious, and you have this idea of non-compromise with evil. Again, I'll sort of pass through this at some speed. 1920 is the first public statement against anti-Semitism. He attends a concert. It's maybe not even that dramatic. It's not yet Nazi anti-Semitism, but there's someone arises to protest the Jewish music of a composer who was of Jewish extraction, and then Hildebrand confronts him on the stairwell after the concert and says, "What is this nonsense?" And he says, "This is the first time I encountered this nonsense of non-Aryan art and science, or bourgeois math coming from the math and science coming from the communist side." But again, this need to speak publicly, and again, this ability to see clearly, this was very widespread, this was very pervasive. This happened to be a more public expression of this, but the sympathy for this kind of anti-Judaism was very much present. Now, you may know that Hitler attempts to seize power in 1923. It comes to nothing, though it does make him a national figure, so it was an important thing in his rise. The Nazis begin, you might say, a new attempt to rise to power through legal means, or Hitler conceives of this and he begins competing in the elections. And in the late 20s and early 30s, there's this surge. And so von Hildebrand becomes, again, very concerned by the Nazi gain and by Hitler's rise to power. And there's this moment in the Catholic churches and the Christian churches, it's perhaps its moment of greatest weakness in the response to Nazism, because the German bishops have been very strong in condemning National Socialism in the 1920s. But then when it became clear that Hitler was on his way to becoming the master of the land, there was a kind of shift to conversation. We have to take a role in this. And there was an attempt to try to find something good in National Socialism. It scandalizes us, but it begins to creep into the theological circles and philosophical circles when Hildebrand is in. He describes a theologian who speaks of the Third Reich as the realization of the body of Christ in the natural world. I mean, things that to us are utterly shocking. And it is a scandalous moment, but it's important to emphasize that it's a moment, really, because the church then woke up, and many of the Catholic bishops became much stronger. But this was precisely the moment in which von Hildebrand was so important, because he could speak with uncompromising clarity at a moment. He knew that bridges could not be built with National Socialism, and he spoke constantly of the complete incompatibility of Christianity and Nazism. Now, Hitler comes to power in January of 1933. He's appointed Chancellor of Germany. And this is a decisive moment in von Hildebrand's witness, because it presents him with, you might say, the realization that whatever plans he might have been making beforehand, he has to decide what his conscience demands of him. And he thinks of himself very much as a philosopher and as a Catholic, and those combined. So he finally decides that I can't speak openly, I won't be able to speak openly, but my role as a philosopher demands that I can speak publicly, and particularly as a Christian philosopher, it would create scandal if I didn't speak openly. Another way of putting it is that perhaps had he not been a philosopher, he perhaps could have seen another way to staying in Germany and retaining his integrity, but he felt that as a philosopher, he couldn't not speak. So this decision to obey his conscience brings us to another point, which is, and this I said a moment ago that his Christian faith, his conversion was the great moment. Well, he owns his conversion in a new way here, because he draws the consequences in a new way. He realizes that he has to leave Germany to speak his mind outside of Germany. But he knows he's going into complete darkness. We know where he's going. We've read the book, right? But he didn't know where he was going. He knew he was giving up a secure career, a beautiful home, a family life, a circle of friends. And he stepped into the complete unknown, but what gave him the little bit of light he needed was the confidence that God would honor his conscience. So he threw himself into the arms of God, and God protected him, as we know. But it was a fateful decision. That's another thing in this theme of witness, that it had enormous consequences, great consequences in his own life and great consequences for the entire intellectual Christian resistance. in that he would go on, as we know, and take his witness public in ways that he didn't even realize at that moment. Now to this point of not knowing what he was doing, he spent about 6 months in discernment, another theme in witness. He went to his home, the home of his birth in Florence, and he experienced this profound isolation, which is, again, I take these to be almost sort of like archetypal in some respect in this sort of interior journey through witness, in that he was surrounded by people who just didn't see what he saw. They saw this in terms of world events unfolding, or they saw it in terms of regional politics. They didn't see the rise of the Antichrist, certainly, as he spoke. And many of them thought he was overreacting. So he felt profoundly alone, and he didn't know what he would do. But from Florence, and again, having taken those steps, he put himself in a position to see what he needed to see to do next. He begins to take note of the one European head of state, the Chancellor of Austria, Engelbert Dollfuss, who had an outspoken anti-Nazi policy. And he says, I want to work for this man. I want to be an intellectual officer in the battle against National Socialism. And as you may have read, it takes some time to get in front of Dollfuss and make his pitch, but Dollfuss is impressed and agrees to finance an anti-Nazi, anti-communist, anti-racist newspaper from a Catholic perspective. And that became the principal vehicle of von Hildebrand's public witness during his almost 5 years in Vienna, where he then lived. So then we have, you might say, the public dimension taking on a whole new front, because now he's providing the stage on which much of the intellectual resistance in Austria is unified and is gathered. And it must be said it was primarily Catholic, but there were lots of voices. There were non-Catholics, there were people writing from various perspectives. The primary condition for being able to write in the journal was that one had to be more than just anti-Nazi for political grounds. There had to be an intellectual and spiritual rejection of Nazism. And another way of putting it is that one couldn't be anti-Nazi, but for example, be anti-Semitic at the same time. That would not have qualified you to write in this journal. Now, just a few observations about how he saw the journal. So, in his mission statement for the journal, he says that the mission of this journal, was wir wollen, he says, what we want, in his sort of leading essay, he says, we want to repropose the great theme, the great ideas of the West, of justice and truth, of the person, of liberty, of community, against the great confusion that now reigns today. And I take this idea of reproposition as being perhaps the most succinct way of expressing what he thought he was doing in this journal. And this is important because though he directed himself at rejecting and denouncing forcefully anti-Semitism and collectivism and totalitarianism, the object of his journal were in fact his readers. The aim was to change hearts and minds. So it's important that one not somehow view this as primarily just a kind of sort of set of theses that rejected a position, but in fact, through great effort, he wanted to win people, bring them back to a position that was lost at the time. And this brings out, you might say, a kind of distinction in the essays. On the one hand are these intellectual essays that analyze first principles. So we studied yesterday the critique of collectivism and of nationalism, big ideas that he thought were dangerous. But then there's a whole second set of essays that you might say have to do with how one lives under an evil regime. You know, how does one preserve one's moral integrity when one is not necessarily in a position simply to leave? And this is important because it's not necessarily about the question of complicity, more formal or material complicity. It has to do with one's inner stance towards this. Does one begin to make peace? Is there a kind of breakdown in my stance towards National Socialism? Do I begin to welcome it, or do I begin to sort of excuse it? To him, it was absolutely vital that if one lived in Germany under this, one had to live in a kind of constant state of inner rejection. And I realize I'm running out of time here, but I will permit myself one quotation that is very dear to me. There, when he wrote a letter to his friends in 1933 at Pentecost, who were back in Germany. He'd left already, and he wanted to express to them what he thought would be the only way they could somehow preserve their moral integrity as Catholics. And he says, I called attention to the terrible danger of allowing oneself to be pressed into compromises, and above all, of inwardly adopting a neutral or even a friendly stance towards National Socialism. I explained that they were being confronted by the Antichrist, and that if they were forced to live with him, indeed even to be exposed to his force. It was absolutely necessary to bear the concealed dagger, as it were, of absolute and irreconcilable enmity, ready to make use of it at the first opportunity without thereby risking the concentration camp. So this you might say, this shifting back from the realm of moral action to the realm of moral stances that were so decisive, he thought, in retaining one's moral and Christian integrity in this moment. One theme that hasn't been mentioned yet, I just mentioned it in passing because it's worth much more discussion, is his critique of anti-Semitism. And I'll simply say that he was one of the early and most total Christian critics of anti-Semitism. The kind of latent anti-Semitism that many of us would like to forget was alive in the Christian world. He fully rejected, and he called attention to it. So he didn't just reject anti-Semitism sort of out there, but he rejected it within his own community and played a very important role in purging the Catholic and Christian world of the anti-Semitism, and was a great figure in laying the groundwork for what changed at Vatican II in the Church's stance towards the Jews in Nostra Aetate. And I would simply say that what he did was to recognize that anti-Semitism was not just a kind of minority problem or a regional conflict between racial groups who hated each other, but that it was fundamentally, more fundamentally perhaps than other racial conflicts, a hatred of humanity as such. He says that and he develops a kind of wonderful sort of basis for this idea, which we can discuss if you all would like during the questions. So this is just to say, I believe I still have, about 10 minutes since we started, about 9:15? Sure. Okay. So I'm going to fast forward here and simply say that the 5 years he spent in Vienna are full of drama. They're full of the difficulty of living under the lengthening shadows of what became increasingly inevitable, that Nazi Germany would annex Austria. One of the things that von Hildebrand was most active in was rallying the Austrian resistance to the idea of this annexation, and that was great. That was very difficult because Austria was divided in many ways. There were many Austrians, and this has an old history, also many Germans, who favored a greater Germany that would include all of the German-speaking peoples. But von Hildebrand realized that was impossible. When we could discuss, Rocco, whether he would have always opposed it under any circumstances, but when it was a matter of joining Austria with Nazi Germany, with the Third Reich, it was completely impossible. And in fact, he thought that Austria had a crucial mission to uphold the great German values, the great German cultural tradition at a moment of what he called Germany's greatest degradation, when everything great in Germany was either being co-opted by the Nazis or suppressed by the Nazis. So a different aspect of his witness, giving witness to the true Germany against a suppression of it by Hitler. Let me just say this, that the years in Vienna are characterized by constant uncertainty, by constant danger of assassination, during which he lived, on the one hand, quite clearly under stress and duress. The pictures that exist that we have of him, there are only a few from 1938 and afterwards, show a very tired and weary-looking Dietrich von Hildebrand. But his voice never becomes tired, or there's a kind of spiritual freshness and even joy and peace that pervade him during this time, and the only explanation of that is not just a sunny temperament, which I think even his sunny temperament, which he had, would eventually have eroded, but it was this constant feeling of being sustained by God. He says, for example, after being warned that he's once again, plans had been made to assassinate him, and he says his poor wife, his first wife, was terrified by this and lived in constant anxiety. He said, it made an impression on me when I was warned, but I can't say in any way it changed my resolve, and I lived in continuing peace because I was so convinced that this was what God wanted of me and that he would protect me. So this is again what I mean by a kind of inner maturation of his life of faith, because whatever Christian commitment he could have lived before having to live in this way during the years he lived in Munich were obviously radically tested, and he lived his faith in ways that one can only live when one lives under this kind of duress. So a few comments to try to distill the Hildebrand witness, to sort of invert from a look through his life, a look at some major themes, also with a view to what they might mean for us today. So the first, I think, is this link between witness and personal vocation. Von Hildebrand was very aware that there were different vocations in the fight against evil. He knew that some, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom he never met, were called to stay in Germany and to work for the undoing of Nazism from within. There were those who were called to live a very intense inner Christian life, sort of ordinary people who had no real recourse to what he did. Not everyone was called to this kind of outspoken witness. And I think he would say to us today that the issue is not necessarily to imitate every great hero, but to ask what we're all called to witness, he would say, but he would say the way in which we're called to witness is clearly defined by our gifts, our talents, and by what God asks of us. Then there's the hierarchy of values, which is a great Hildebrandian theme, and the primacy of the moral and the religious. I would just say that Von Hildebrand, he wanted to win, of course. He probably thought at certain moments that perhaps Austria could be a bulwark against Nazi Germany, and perhaps there was a moment where they thought that perhaps the Nazis would there would be an internal implosion. There's a moment that he describes where they turned out to be this terrible purge that Hitler committed, the Night of the Long Knives. But from the outside, it looked like perhaps there was a revolt and that Hitler would be toppled. So there was every reason to think that perhaps they could win, but in a way, it didn't matter, and it increasingly didn't matter as it became obvious that winning wasn't an option. And he says so beautifully, this is why I selected as the epigraph of the book a line from 35, I think, where he says, "If God permits evils such as Bolshevism and National Socialism, then of course, as St. Paul says, it is to test us. It is precisely our struggle against evil that God wills, even when we suffer external defeat." And by the time he fled and arrived as a refugee to the United States, he lived in a way, you might say, that all human and worldly dimensions of life were stripped away. All of the social roles that we spoke about were gone. He had no professorship, he had no career, he had no life in a way. He lived exclusively in his response to this moment. And that was only possible because he gave himself over to the primacy of the moral and the religious in his life. I've mentioned moral stances, and I would just say that one of the great themes in Von Hildebrand's witness is precisely what it means to live with moral integrity when there's not just evil in the world, but when this evil becomes all-pervasive. How does one preserve oneself? And again, in his essays, he speaks about the essay on the danger of becoming morally blunted is a wonderful work in which he tries to strengthen his fellow Catholics, remind them what it would take to build up their inner commitment to their faith. Now, another point is having living roots in faith and morals. There's an essay in this book called The Parting of Ways, which one can read in two ways. There's a way in which it can seem almost idealistic. He seems to say that any true Christian will simply be immune to Nazism, and that seems so overstated. He says, for example, the fact that National Socialism possesses some kind of attraction for many Catholics starkly reveals that Christ has not reigned as king in their hearts, even if they are daily communicants and profess to be believing, convinced Catholics. Or he says, how is it even possible for the glorification of race to enthrall a person who has been born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God? To us, maybe that seems obvious, but at the time, clearly that was not the way that many Catholics went. But I take him to mean that if one consciously roots oneself and re-roots oneself and lives the life of faith fully, and also lives, in some respects, a kind of intellectual life, or at least a life of formation in one's basic moral commitments, that then there will be no appeal, or the appeal will diminish. So I take that to be an extremely important legacy for us to think about today. Then there's this issue of cultivating an awareness of our influences. I think I'll just leave it briefly that it's so extraordinary how uninfluenced he was by the ideas that swept through Germany and Austria at the day. He says that of himself in many places, that he had a kind of gift to detect what was in the air and to remain uninfluenced by it. And I think that as far as we're concerned today, there is a great deal of, there's a kind of inner discernment that has to take place at any point in time as to how much we are allowing ourselves to be influenced. And I think of what Professor Buttiglione said yesterday about the process of dialogue with culture, in which we we in some point have to, we either own our culture when we recognize it as good, or we reject aspects of it and we purify ourselves through this constant dialogue with the culture around us. So anyways, this issue of purifying ourselves of influences and at the same time owning what is good around us. I mentioned reproposition. This idea, the way I take this is that von Hildebrand realized that even in 1933, that the Christian West didn't fully exist anymore. It existed more than it does today. And he mentions that it's still recognizable. It's still recognizable today, I think, as well, in many respects. But he knew, if we think we have to repropose it today, he knew he had to repropose it to people in the 1930s, and that precisely this was the contribution he could make. And I would say that reproposition is perhaps, he would say, it's one of the fundamental modes of cultural engagement that we aim to persuade. I think he would make his own the words of St. Peter in his first letter, which Pope Benedict is very fond of quoting, simply that we must always be prepared to offer an account of the hope that is within us. This is it doesn't mean to argue it in intellectual terms, but to make it comprehensible, to invite people into considering it with us. Again, that was the mission of his paper, to repropose the great ideas of the West. Two more points. One is that for von Hildebrand, Christianity is intrinsically linked to the common good. And the reason I mention that is because we have a lot of discussion today about the so-called Benedict option, right, or the idea of creative minorities. And the Benedict option is this idea that perhaps we've so much lost the larger battles, that what Christians should do is turn inwards in a certain respect and live vibrant lives of faith and learning, and in some sense be centers of preserving the greatness of Western and Christian culture. And in some respects, there will be a spillover effect, and perhaps even a disproportionate effect to our dwindling numbers, but that really our focus is inward. And Rabbi Sachs has written beautifully about this in his 2013 Erasmus lecture. It's an important idea of creative minorities. But I think von Hildebrand would say that Christians can never just decide to be a creative minority, that there's something in the Christian impulse, in the Great Commission, that spreads even into our work in building up culture and civilization. And I think, though I don't want to sort of quote it irresponsibly, there is in the essay on the danger of quietism, when he speaks about, I don't know if I wrote down the page number, but in any case, let me see if I have it right here. In the essay on quietism, he addresses Catholics who thought that it was more important and really the only way forward to kind of turn inwards and to live an intense Catholic life and basically disengage from political Catholicism, which had its own abuses. And von Hildebrand writes, I think I should know what page this is on. But let's see. Now that I've told you I'm going to read it, I will read it. I wrote down all the page numbers, if I can find it. It's just a lot more powerful than his words, but apparently I can't find it. But in any case, he says, for example, that for Catholics not to take seriously their political obligations, he calls it desertion of the flag, and he calls it a kind of scandal. So he thinks that though it may not at every point in time be possible to have a fully Christian culture, that Christians have to understand that their commitment is not at any point in time simply to themselves and to their own communities, but to the world at large. I think also this theme is wonderfully augmented then in Vatican II in the language of, for example, in Gaudium et Spes, when one speaks of the building up of culture in the world. Finally, let me just end on this theme of love as the great driver of von Hildebrand. I think that the deepest and most winning aspect of von Hildebrand are his loves. One can misread him by reading some of his statements if one thinks of them as sort of primarily intellectual propositions. I view him as someone who lived so deeply through a kind of rich affective life that the ardor and the conviction with which he speaks is rooted in his great love of the great realities, of the great truths, and also of his own culture. He loved German culture. He loved Western European culture deeply. And I think that this is what makes him so winning, because just at a moment when he, for example, speaks... I have a wonderful assistant here in Michael Novak. All right, I'm going to interrupt myself and just read this quickly. This is back on political Catholicism. He says, there's so much that he says here. He says, when today the Antichrist is rearing his head in Bolshevism and National Socialism, when Christ is persecuted with unprecedented hatred and a revolt is raging not only against the sphere of the supernatural, but even of the person in general, all Catholics must fight for Christ in the political sphere with full commitment, representing in season and out of season the claims of the kingdom of God, and thus those of morality and the natural law. And that's the general spirit of this essay, that our contribution to the public good as Christians is non-negotiable. Now, he would recognize that we do it in different ways, again, according to our vocation, but this idea of a kind of large-scale, whole-scale withdrawal from political life was unacceptable. But to this theme of love as the driving force, in his heart, in his book, The Heart, he has this beautiful meditation on the heart as the real self. And he wants to show that some of the deepest responses in the person are affective in nature. They're felt primarily, not thought or willed primarily, though the will and the intellect are always involved. And he wants to bring this out by showing that there are even moments in which the heart and the will, for example, have different vocations, different callings, different themes. So he describes, for example, the death of a person. And, without a rich notion of the heart, it's easy to fall into a narrative where the primary explanation is that we have to simply accept what God asks of us. And our grief has to somehow be completely subsumed into that acceptance. But Hildebrand would say, no, that precisely the voice of the heart, this heartbreak, this longing for the presence of the lost person, is the right response of the heart, but it is combined with the response of the will, which is one of acceptance. And I see this throughout the fight against National Socialism, that on the one hand, there is a complete rejection of and a denunciation of National Socialism, and even a kind of righteous anger, if I can put it that way, or perhaps a prophetic wrath in which he expresses himself. But I think you'll agree that the primary emotion that comes through is one of love for his fellow Catholics, for his fellow Germans, and disappointment, for example, rather than anger. A feeling of loss for Germany, a sense of how much was at stake. And I think that this love for what is good and for what is true and what is beautiful, and this desire to share this with everyone, is what is so defining of his stance and of his witness. And let me just give him the final word by quoting what he said to his wife, Alice von Hildebrand, who asked him many years later if it was not difficult for him to live, particularly in such difficult circumstances, in such poverty. He'd lived, of course, in great homes and villas in Florence and Munich, and then he became a beggar. And she says, was it not hard for you to live in these slummy apartments, and so on? And he says, he looked at me in utter amazement. How could you ask such a question? He exclaimed, for nothing in the world would I have traded the joy of tasting the sweetness of Christian charity. So there's nothing I can really add to that final sentiment of his, other than to say that I think that really is the man. Said to his wife, not believing she would repeat it probably, and yet thanks to her we know it. And so I hope this at least gives us a beginning for considering the witness of von Hildebrand, again realizing that this is one aspect of his witness, but the aspect that I wanted to bring out because it has such a bearing on all of us as Christians, many of us as philosophers, and our own discernment, our own question that I think von Hildebrand would ultimately ask of all of us, which is simply, what is my vocation to witness?